Bueno, pues tengo el gusto de presentar al doctor Daniel Fries. Daniel Fries cuenta con un doctorado en geografía de humedales por la Universidad de Cambridge en Inglaterra. Actualmente es profesor asociado y decano del Departamento de Geografía de la Universidad Nacional de Singapur. Daniel Fries lleva más de 16 años, aún tan joven como es, trabajando en manglares y en los últimos 9 años se ha enfocado en carbono azul. Daniel realiza un trabajo interdisciplinario que abarca modelaciones globales de emisiones, estimaciones de almacenes y flujos de carbono, así como análisis socioeconómicos. Todo lo anterior para poder comprender los alcances y limitaciones de los proyectos de bono de carbono. Si bien la mayor parte de su trabajo está enfocada en manglares, también ha realizado proyectos de carbono azul en pastos marinos y sus zonas de trabajo incluyen Singapur, Tailandia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Filipinas, Madagascar y Nueva Caledonia. Daniel también es director adjunto del Centro de Soluciones Naturales para el Cambio Climático de la Universidad Nacional de Singapur y miembro del equipo de trabajo para pastos marinos de la Iniciativa Internacional del Carbono Azul. Finalmente, una de sus actividades favoritas es explorar nuevos manglares. Adelante, Daniel, y esperamos verte pronto aquí en México.
Muchas gracias. Daniel Fries.
Hi, everyone.
Yes,
Okay.
it's your turn.
Okay. Hi. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation. It's a real honor because Mexico has such a great global reputation for mangrove mapping and blue carbon, and so it's a real great pleasure to be part of this. Thank you. Let me just share my screen. I hope everyone can see. Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Great. So thank you. So yeah, I was asked to give a kind of a global picture of kind of the state of blue carbon across the world, and maybe show some success stories, but also some of the challenges that we have going forward. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge that what you're going to see over the next 30 minutes or so is the ideas of lots of people, including Kath as well. So thank you, Kath. And so I just wanted to acknowledge everybody up front for what I'm just lucky enough to present their work. Okay. There are three things I'd like to talk about today. First of all, the scale of the issue and why we need blue carbon and why it's so important globally. The scale of the global opportunities for blue carbon, both for national governments, but also for companies and the corporate sector. And the scale of some of the limitations that we're finding around the world, which is why we have all of this interest and opportunity, but we haven't made the most of it yet. And I think that's really the key message here. If there's one thing you remember from this talk, is that there are lots of success stories and lots of interest and momentum, but it is still really difficult. And it's blue carbon has all of this promise, but it's not as straightforward as a lot of people are communicating around the world. And I think we have a short window of time in order to address those challenges while we still have all of this interest in blue carbon. So I'll start with a thing that I think many of you would know, that blue carbon ecosystems were previously considered some of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet. Particularly rates of mangrove and seagrass loss, which we thought exceeded the rates of loss for tropical rainforests and coral reefs. And this was a message that was very strong, particularly in the kind of the early 2000s, and some really key papers in 2001 and 2007, which we're talking about rates of loss of mangroves, for example, of 1 to 3% per year globally, and seagrasses even more. And so, we have a big blue carbon ecosystem conservation problem. Now, to be fair, things have got a lot better, at least for mangroves. Anyways, as we've started to understand more about mangrove dynamics, it seems that mangrove deforestation rates have reduced, which is good news. It's unclear if that's the case in other blue carbon ecosystems around the world, but for mangroves it is. But we still have a problem with blue carbon ecosystem decline. And this is just one example that shows, even though that mangrove loss rates globally have gone from 1 to 3% per year in the 20th century to maybe only 0.13% per year in the 21st century, we are still losing mangroves, and we are still losing them predominantly due to human land use change. And that's particularly in Southeast Asia, where I'm from, but also other parts of the world, including Central and South America. So even though the problem has got better, we're still losing some of these blue carbon ecosystems. And we're losing them, said, for mostly human land uses. And in Southeast Asia, for example, it's primarily due to aquaculture and other commodity production. And this is a great paper led by Fernanda Adame, who showed the issue of this for blue carbon. So if we take mangrove deforestation and project it to the end of the century, we're able to estimate the emissions caused by that. And you can see that there are some hotspots of blue carbon emissions for mangrove loss. One is Southeast Asia, but also the Caribbean as well. So we are, we have a problem that we are going to be losing, obviously, biodiversity and a range of ecosystem services, while also adding to the issue of climate change. But climate change does give us an opportunity to use carbon for conservation, because there is a huge amount of interest in these natural climate solutions to help mitigate the worst impacts of climate change and to help us get to net zero by the mid of this century. And countries have to get to net zero, but also increasingly a number of companies also have quite ambitious net zero targets. And this graph here just shows a number of IPCC pathways that will help us to get to net zero. And of course, the big thing is that we have to reduce fossil fuels and decarbonize our economies. But in all of these pathways, there is a role for natural climate solutions, such as blue carbon ecosystems, to help us contribute to these net zero targets. And so natural climate solutions are about 20 different options that will help us mitigate climate change using natural environments. And wetlands and blue carbon are certainly part of that. They may not be the largest solutions, but I think, if you can see from this graph here, reforestation and tropical forest conversion are the biggest ones. But wetlands are certainly, the same magnitude as some of the other natural climate solutions for grasslands, for example. And I think what's impressive about this is that their area of wetlands is much smaller than a lot of the agricultural and grassland systems. And this is because of their high carbon densities, etc., that they can play quite a meaningful role despite their small area. So you get a lot more kind of bang for your buck with blue carbon ecosystems. And as a result, we're seeing just huge interest from governments, but also from the commercial sector. And at least from the commercial sector in Southeast Asia, a lot of that interest has been in the last 18 months and people thinking about a green recovery from COVID, etc. So we're seeing so much interest from from stakeholders that were never really in discussions about blue carbon ecosystem conservation before, which is really encouraging. And so all of that interest, I think, translates into two key opportunities. The first one at the national level and the second one at the corporate level. And so, the Paris Agreement and subsequent negotiations have really driven home how important blue carbon is for many countries to meet their nationally determined contribution targets. And there's really high scope to do so because over 150 countries contain a blue carbon ecosystem, either mangrove, seagrass, or salt marsh, or a combination of them. And if we just take the example of mangroves to show the contribution that these blue carbon ecosystems can make to offsetting national emissions, we think there are at least 17 countries where just the sequestration from mangroves may offset more than 5% of national greenhouse gas emissions. These are countries such as Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Madagascar, Mozambique, but also a number of countries in Central and South America. And then there are probably another 17 countries or so where we could offset, at least 1% of national greenhouse gas emissions. And again, many of these in Central and South America, as well as West Africa. And so, there are a number of countries where blue carbon could make a meaningful contribution to nationally determined contributions. So we have opportunities at the national level for many countries around the world. And we could expect similar or greater numbers for seagrass, I would think. And we're seeing some of this opportunity translated into national policies. And so the last year or so, countries have been updating their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. And we are, for the first time, seeing really explicit targets for blue carbon within these NDCs. The first NDCs, people mentioned quite broadly about mangrove and seagrass conservation, but for the first time, we're seeing concrete and measurable targets. So, and these have all happened in the last year with these updates. And so Belize, a couple of months ago, announced that they would protect 12,000 hectares of mangroves by 2030. The Seychelles last month announced that by 2030, they would be protecting 100% of all of their mangroves and seagrasses, etc. And you can see some of the other targets here. And more will be coming. So a couple of countries have declared that they will incorporate blue carbon ecosystems in the next round of NDC accounting. And then other countries, such as the Philippines, are starting to introduce, as we speak, new mangrove forest laws. The USA currently has a Blue Carbon for Our Planet Act, which is a bipartisan bill, which is going through both the Senate and the House in the US. And so we're seeing for the first time these big kind of national commitments, which is really exciting. And I think in the next round of NDCs, we will see even more. So there are these huge opportunities at the national level, but the corporate sector has really got excited about blue carbon. And it's really exciting to be in Singapore at the moment because Singapore is positioning itself as a regional carbon trading hub. And we've just established a carbon exchange to facilitate carbon credit projects. And we must sit down for coffee with corporate partners, once every couple of weeks, who all of a sudden want to know about blue carbon and how they can invest in it and how they can help establish projects. And these are just two reports that I've been involved in of many different reports. The first one from Earth Security, showing that mangrove restoration alone may be able to generate about $11 billion of investment globally. The report on the right, Business Case for Natural Climate Solutions, was commissioned by an international investment portfolio company based here in Singapore. and really showing, again, how many billions of dollars for Southeast Asia, green and blue carbon may be able to unlock. And so we've been interested in trying to show exactly what are the opportunities for local kind of carbon credit projects for the commercial sector. And we've been able to look at that by combining a number of different data sets. So obviously how much carbon there is and its distribution globally, using some really good global data sets. We've only been able to do this for mangroves, unfortunately, because that's where we have the best data globally. So if we add our carbon layers to a deforestation layer, which allows us to understand how many mangroves are suitable for offsetting, because for a lot of carbon offsetting, you can only do that on mangroves that are previously threatened. And then we add some economic information about the price of establishing blue carbon projects, the price of carbon, etc. And that allows us to work out mangroves that are investable, which means they would qualify for a commercial blue carbon project, and mangroves that are profitable, which means that they would be financially viable, that the carbon credit price exceeds the price of establishing and maintaining a project. And this is important because that these projects make profit, because we have to use that profit to offset the costs of aquaculture or any other alternative land use. And it looks that actually a decent proportion of the world's mangroves would qualify for commercial carbon projects, particularly in Southeast Asia. These are the green mangroves, which would be profitable, but also in West Africa, parts of Central America, South America, etc. And it turns out that 20% of the world's mangroves might qualify for blue carbon credit projects, and 10% of them would create profits which could go towards paying for the opportunity cost of different land uses. And even at a quite low carbon credit price, it may generate over $1 billion per year in conservation financing, which is a fantastic amount, which would have, if used correctly, would have real conservation impact. And we are starting to see some of these opportunities being realized, which I think is great. And blue carbon projects, commercial projects on the ground have maybe been a bit slower than the opportunities available. But in the last year or two, we're seeing more projects being proposed and coming online. And I thought I'd just highlight two that you may be familiar with. The first is Mikoko Pamoja, which is in Gazi Bay in Kenya. And it's considered one of the world's first blue carbon projects, which was selling credits through a mechanism called Plan Vivo. It was quite a small project, but it was able to generate a number of credits. In the less than 10 years since that was established, we've seen a big upscaling of some of the projects. And one of the most recent, which was announced earlier this year, is a project led by Conservation International, Invamar, and a few other stakeholders, protecting 9,600 hectares of mangroves. And over, I think, about a 20-year time period is expected to generate credits in excess of 1.4 million tons of carbon dioxide. So we're seeing more and more projects come online, and we'll see more in the future. Most of these are based on mangroves, but there are discussions in the US, for example, about incorporating seagrasses into some of these projects. So we have opportunities, national scale, opportunities for the commercial sector, and most of those are focused on avoided deforestation or conserving previously threatened mangroves and creating carbon credits through that process. But of course, we know that restoration is also really important for blue carbon. And again, a lot of the focus on restoration is, particularly at large scales, has been on mangrove forests because it's maybe easier to scale up mangrove restoration compared to seagrass restoration. But certainly there's, again, very important and large government interest in the rehabilitation of degraded blue carbon ecosystems. And this is not necessarily just because of blue carbon. And in fact, we've had lots of interest in restoration, particularly in Southeast Asia due to the Indian Ocean tsunami and other natural hazards such as Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. But we're certainly seeing more and more discussion again around blue carbon. And Indonesia is really leading the way in this. A lot of countries have ambitious national restoration targets, but Indonesia has, I think, some of the biggest. And I'll be honest that I can't keep up with them because they keep increasing the targets all the time. And so I think these are the most recent targets, but there's they're updating this and becoming more and more ambitious all the time. So within the next 2 years, the Indonesian government is aiming to restore 600,000 hectares of mangroves, which is a huge amount. And of course, there are questions about doing that in a sustainable way, but at least the ambition and the commitment and the funding is there to do so. And there are opportunities globally for restoration. This is a project led by the Nature Conservancy and the University of Cambridge, and a number of us were involved, including Kath, to understand what the global potential for mangrove restoration might be. And it seems that globally, using some coarse global criteria that are focused on biophysical aspects, that there might be at least 800,000 hectares of areas potentially restorable for mangroves around the world. And it would be great to do such a map for seagrass and salt marshes. So, and if we were to restore these 800,000 hectares of mangroves, this tool calculates that, the hundreds of millions of tons of carbon that would save, the people protected from storms, etc. And all of this information is freely available on the website that's linked here. And you can also zoom into the country level. So I've just shown Mexico here. And again, this model estimates that, out of that 800,000 hectares globally, that maybe 145,000 hectares or so might be restorable nationally across Mexico. Of course, these are global models, right? So you have to take them with a pinch of salt when you zoom into particular areas, but at least it shows you the relative scope and distribution of areas that might be more successful and have more potential for restoration. And we know that restoration can deliver substantial blue carbon benefits. This is a PhD chapter from Clint Cameron, who did his PhD at Charles Darwin University, but based on mangroves in Sulawesi in Indonesia. And he was able to calculate all of the carbon budget, the stocks and fluxes of natural and restored mangroves. And he was able to show that some of these restored mangroves were able to have a net sequestration of between, mostly about 30 tons of carbon dioxide per year, but in some scenarios, almost 70 tons of carbon dioxide per year. And what was interesting about this was that these restoration and other projects were able to generate far more carbon credits than other terrestrial projects that have been going on for a few years now. And so, the average terrestrial project is able to generate around 10 tons of carbon dioxide per year. And so we're maybe able to get, 3 to 7 times more carbon credits per hectare with these mangrove restoration projects than with terrestrial projects. And so again, you don't need a huge amount of area to be able to generate a number of credits for the commercial sector, but also hopefully that some of that finance goes to community livelihood projects on the ground. And so I hope that kind of shows you that globally there is a lot of opportunity for blue carbon, whether it's through national accounting or whether it's through getting the commercial sector to invest in blue carbon conservation and restoration and support the coastal communities that rely on these ecosystems. So that sounds great, right? But if we have all of this opportunity and we have all of this excitement and we have all of this momentum, then why don't we have thousands of blue carbon projects all around the world? Or why doesn't every country have explicit targets for blue carbon conservation and restoration in their nationally determined contributions? And that's really a question that I've been interested in, is what is stopping this momentum and opportunity? And I think there's a number of constraints which we have to overcome, but I can broadly put them into 4 different categories. Firstly, we still do have some scientific and technical constraints to verifying and monitoring blue carbon. We have a range of socioeconomic constraints that affect the financial viability of blue carbon projects. There are a range of governance issues that complicate land tenure and carbon ownership, which we need to fix. And then there are some key ecosystem constraints that we don't have enough knowledge about particular ecosystems. So as you would have noticed in this presentation, I've talked a lot about mangroves, and that's because we have a lot of information about mangroves, but we lack similar quality and distribution of information for seagrass, for salt marshes, and then also for other ecosystems which are starting to be discussed within blue carbon, such as macroalgae. So I thought I'd just spend the last bit of this talk just talking about these constraints, because I don't think we talk about them enough. Sometimes we're so excited about blue carbon and communicating to our stakeholders and policymakers about the importance of blue carbon, that I think it's important that we give a realistic picture. And because if we don't solve these constraints or reduce them, then we're not going to be able to make the best use of those opportunities. So let's talk about the scientific constraints first. I mean, I think I'll be honest, I don't think this is the biggest constraint, because I think we actually know a lot more than we realize about blue carbon. Academics don't often say that, right? Because we always want to justify our work and our data collections by saying that we need to know more. But I think, at least for conservation and restoration, I think we know enough already. Of course, we can always improve that and add new things. But certainly there are some scientific knowledge gaps. And this paper that came out in 2019, which was trying to summarize the state of the science in blue carbon, did highlight a few knowledge gaps, particularly around fluxes. So we have a lot of focus on carbon stocks, but often in a lot of blue carbon credit projects, for example, its fluxes are just as important, because we're looking at the change in carbon through time, not just the current stocks. So that's certainly a gap, that we don't focus on fluxes enough. And also we don't have as strong an understanding as we need of the impact of different management interventions, disturbances and loss, restoration and climate change. And these are quite important for carbon accounting, because we need to know the emissions factor of some of these conversions and their impact on blue carbon. And so that does translate into project technical challenges, where we focus on stocks because they're relatively easy and cheap to measure, but we don't have kind of cheap and easy ways of estimating fluxes and groundwater discharge and tidal exchange of dissolved organic carbon, etc., and everything else that contributes to the blue carbon bank account. We don't just need to know how much money is in our blue carbon bank, but we need to know how much money or blue carbon is coming in and going out, and what the net of that is. And so this is where a lot of interest from the corporate sector in Southeast Asia has gone towards, is how we reduce the cost of verifying blue carbon projects, particularly of fluxes, because they can be quite expensive to measure, and it's quite hard to do rapid assessments and get an accurate figure in a very short space of time. And certainly this is where a lot of our research is going now. And just in the last few months, we were funded for a 5-year program by an international investment company to work out how to reduce the cost of some of these measurements. And I think we're going to see companies investing in this a lot more, particularly as some of the verification protocols are still quite new. There's only really one official Vera blue carbon methodology, for example, and others are trying to think of similar methodologies. And so this is quite an open space of how we measure fluxes, how we measure aspects of soil carbon in a rapid and cost-effective way. But I think also a lot of people invest in that because it's maybe one of the easier constraints to overcome, right? You know, improving methodologies is a concrete and straightforward constraint. Still difficult, but you know, quite straightforward, I think. Certainly more straightforward than some of the more human constraints, particularly the socioeconomic and the governance. But this is, for me, these are the biggest challenges, because if we can have all the science in the world, and we can have all of the knowledge, and we can have the interest in blue carbon, but if we don't have places on the ground to do projects because of the governance constraints or because the socioeconomics don't work, then we can't utilize any of that science. So I think that these human constraints are, for me, by far the most important. And I can give you an example of how important they are. So I showed you in a few slides ago that restoration potential map. And that restoration potential map suggests that for mangroves, there are over 3,000 square kilometers of areas that are suitable for restoration, you know, in terms of biophysical parameters. But if we start to add the socioeconomic parameters to it, then actually that reduces quite substantially. So, and if we add the opportunity cost, if we add constraints around land use, and if the land is available for restoration or not, then all of a sudden we don't have 3,000 square kilometers of restoration area. We have maybe 5 to 35% of that area that's suitable for restoration. And this is exactly what we see on the ground, that there are, you know, despite all of these big ambitious restoration targets in Southeast Asia, there are very few sites to do them on. And this is why people then start to plant on mudflats and seagrass meadows, because they are easier sites in terms of cost and governance and land tenure, even if they are going to be much less successful for mangrove restoration. But it's these socioeconomic and governance issues that push people to plant on these biophysically unsuitable sites. And it's not just at these larger scales that these constraints happen. If you go into villages that are at the heart of blue carbon projects and interview them and speak to them about the socioeconomics, we see that actually often these blue carbon projects are not that viable in terms of the economics. So, you know, we had a project where we interviewed people at a potential blue carbon project in the Philippines. And it seemed that because of the cost of carbon credits is quite low at the moment, that actually the money generated from the carbon credits wasn't really that much. It was less than 10% of the village income. And so it wasn't, you know, is it enough to change people's use of the land and to stop aquaculture or other uses and convince people to convert to blue carbon conservation and restoration instead. If we're going to persuade people to do this, we need to be able to generate carbon credits at a scale which at least matches their current livelihoods and hopefully exceeds that, so that we can persuade people to change their impact on the environment. And at least in this example, there were other sources of employment that were generating more money: aquaculture, people's families sending money to the village, etc. And so, it wasn't changing the financial landscape of the villages that we were speaking to. And of course, this is important because at the end of the day, blue carbon conservation isn't just for the environment, but it's also for the coastal communities that rely on them. Kind of linked to these socioeconomic constraints are these governance constraints, and that we have all of this interest from governments to do blue carbon conservation and restoration, yet many countries don't have policies that allow that, that either allow carbon credit projects or clarify who owns the carbon, so who can generate money from carbon credits. Just because a company may rent or own a site doesn't necessarily mean they own the carbon that's above and below the ground. That may still be the government. There are some countries that have pretty good laws. One is Vietnam. It has a payments for ecosystem service regulation, and it's helped kick off a lot of ecosystem service projects because of that. But generally, a lot of countries don't. And in fact, it's caused some quite a lot of complications because some countries have actually paused commercial carbon projects at the moment. And this is one example from Indonesia, but other countries have also done this because it's the tension between the national and the commercial carbon accounting, because countries have to report this for the Paris Agreement and their nationally determined contributions. But if a country reports it, it's very difficult for a company to report it, particularly if the carbon credits are being sold overseas, because you can't count the same carbon twice. You can either count it in the national or in the commercial, but not both. And because the governments often own a number of these blue carbon resources, it's been difficult for some of these market mechanisms to sell carbon credits commercially to form, because it's too risky for companies, because they don't know if they invest in a carbon project, if they will actually get the carbon, or if it will go to the national accounts. And this is a big issue more generally around the Paris Agreement, which I think is going to be discussed at the COP26 in the UK in a couple of weeks. But until we solve this issue, this to me is one of the biggest constraints for blue carbon. And then finally, we have this ecosystem constraint and these ecosystem constraints are to do with the science, to do with the socioeconomics, and to do with the governance. So we have a lack of information. This map shows seagrass extent globally, measured versus modeled, and there's quite a big difference between the two. So we're not really too sure how much seagrass that we have in many parts of the world. We have issues when setting up carbon projects, because again, the land ownership for seagrass can be even more complicated than for mangroves. How you protect seagrasses is more complicated, because it's not just deforestation like in a mangrove, but we have watershed stresses, eutrophication, and sources of threats which may be hundreds of kilometers away. And so how do you use carbon credits to pay for people to stop? That is quite difficult. And then we have big scientific knowledge gaps around macroalgae, which you can see on this diagram, about how much of that carbon is buried or not in the open ocean, and if it really is contributing to blue carbon or not. So we have a lot of constraints to ecosystems beyond mangroves. So if we think it's difficult in mangrove forests, it could be even more difficult in some of these other blue carbon ecosystems. And so just to summarize that, with this huge interest, and there really is more interest than ever before. And I think we have a short window to capitalize on that, and to get these stakeholders involved that were never normally involved before. And I think that's a great thing. But if we're going to do that successfully, then we cannot ignore all of those challenges that I just talked about. And all of those challenges are global. Every country is going to face them to a different degree. And then I thought I would just end with one extra point, which I end a lot of my blue carbon talks with, which is let's not forget that carbon is just one of the many co-benefits that blue carbon ecosystems provide. And maybe utilizing some of these other ecosystem services might help get us across some of those constraints that I talked about. And so with that, thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, doctor. Si les parece bien, vamos a iniciar con la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Tenemos varias preguntas ahí registradas, así que me voy a permitir leerlas para todos los asistentes. La primera de estas preguntas la hace Efraín Payán Casares y dice: ¿existe alguna institución o asociación a nivel Latinoamérica que brinde cursos de capacitación o intercambios de experiencias con este tipo de temáticas?
I think some of my other colleagues on the call might be more suitable to answer that question. But one, maybe I can, from a Southeast Asian perspective, I could add one thing, which I think there is a lot of opportunity to share knowledge between regions. So not just within Central and Latin America, but sharing knowledge between Southeast Asia and Mexico and other countries in the region, because there's a lot of common issues between both those regions. So certainly there are big international groups that might help us to do that. And I think within Central and South America, there's a lot of expertise now in establishing projects. And I think the Colombia project is a game changer, that we now for the first time have we have a roadmap for establishing projects. So certainly within your region, there is a lot of expertise. Thank you.
Gracias, doctor. De hecho, están compartiendo algo de información en el chat. Si gustan también checar de nuevo los comentarios. La siguiente pregunta es de Irma González. Hola, Irma. ¿Cuáles son las condicionantes para que una zona de manglares sea elegida para bonos de carbono azul?
Yeah, okay, thanks. I think there are a number of criteria that you should consider. Obviously, the first is the amount of carbon. That's obviously quite key. There might be some areas that have more carbon than others, but that's not the only consideration, because even areas with lower carbon, there might still be really important reasons to conserve them, right? And I think this is an issue when we only think about carbon, we might exclude very important ecosystems and areas just because they don't have as much carbon. But certainly that would be one thing. But I think some of the most important criteria, I think, are the socioeconomic ones, so that, to pick areas that are feasible for conservation or restorations, where you have community support for projects, where you have local government support for projects, and where the carbon credit generated can actually have an impact and will offset the price of aquaculture or anything else. And for me, those are maybe even more important than how much carbon is there, because you can have the highest amount of carbon in the world, but if you can't get the project established, then you will waste a lot of time and effort trying to establish it, or that you will end up planting mangroves in the wrong place where they won't survive, and these kind of things. Thank you.
Gracias, Daniel. La siguiente pregunta creo que se puede relacionar un poco con la pregunta de Irma también. Dulce Laura Flores pregunta cómo funcionan los créditos de carbono. Y lo que quiero mencionar aquí, si me permites, Daniel, es el jueves tenemos una conferencia específica sobre este tema en donde se va a hablar largo y tendido. Y una de las cuestiones que se van a comentar ahí es el tema de las condicionantes y el rol que tienen quienes están promoviendo el proyecto de los proyectos o los bonos de carbono azul. Así que me voy a pasar a la siguiente pregunta. Karina Leal menciona dónde podemos ver los mapas que se mostraron en la presentación. El video de la sesión del día de hoy va a ser subido a redes sociales. Pueden consultar ahí esos mapas. Y también en cada una de las imágenes que presentó Daniel hay la referencia a los artículos científicos, ¿no? Las fuentes originales, entonces también ahí se pueden consultar. Si te parece correcta mi respuesta, Daniel, o si tienes algún comentario al respecto.
I'll just add that most of the maps, if not all of them, are freely available online. So it's not just the slides I presented, but you can access them on web platforms. And if you just, I think I put either the web link or the paper reference in all of those maps, and you should be able to download or view the data openly through those. Yeah.
Gracias, Daniel. Tenemos tiempo para una sola pregunta. Antes de pasar a la siguiente parte de la sesión del día de hoy, voy a leer la pregunta de Carlos Zamora Tobar. Dice, uno de los éxitos de reforestar con mangles en México es la participación e involucramiento comunitarios. ¿Cuál es su experiencia en este sentido en donde ha trabajado?
Yeah, this is really important in many parts of Southeast Asia, and we commonly see that conservation outcomes or restoration outcomes are much more successful in community managed projects compared to large scale plantations that have not involved the community. Because you need the community to obviously to help conduct the restoration, but also to monitor and to enforce the protection of those areas. And if you don't have the communities on board, that is much more difficult to do. So certainly in our experiences working with NGOs in Southeast Asia, such as Mangrove Action Project and Blue Forests, they've really shown to me just how important community engagement is. And of course, it takes a longer time, right? And it's smaller scale, but that investment in time, and these two NGOs spend a lot of time before they do any restoration at all, just working with the community, gaining trust and getting them on board the project. It is one of the key criteria. And I think we can't forget the reasons why we do these projects. Partly it's for conservation, but at least for me, it's also partly for the livelihoods of communities that rely on those resources. So they should be at the center of all of these discussions.
Muchas gracias, Daniel, también por tu participación. Vamos a dar unos minutos de descanso en lo que preparamos la siguiente sesión de la doctora Catherine Lovelock. Regresamos en 5 minutos. Gracias.